Night did not fall in this part of the world so much as it arrived with intent, quiet, patient, inevitable. The high plateau of Calbrith was a wide-backed beast of stone and wind, and the observatory that clung to its spine seemed less a building than a stubborn thought carved into the rock. Lamps behind narrow panes glowed amber against the dark, and above them the sky spread like a deep well, crowded with cold fire. Serelis Quen stood alone on the open deck, her cloak pulled tight at the throat, ink still smudged along the side of her thumb. The air smelled of frost and iron. It pressed against her cheeks and made her eyes water, but she did not retreat. She had learned long ago that the heavens did not reward comfort. They rewarded persistence. A brass-limbed instrument rose at her side, its joints polished by years of careful hands. She adjusted the declination ring by a breath's width, then paused, listening not for voices, but for the subtle rhythm of the world. The plateau wind worried at the railing. Far below, unseen in the dark, the valley river kept its patient course. Above, the constellations held their ancient places, as if the sky were a map that had never been allowed to change. Except it did change. It changed in ways most people never noticed, and that was why she was here. Serelis opened her notebook against her knee and checked the last line she'd written. The numbers were tidy, the script narrow. She liked her thoughts to be legible, especially when she was tired. Beneath the calculations, she'd sketched a small arc and marked it with a symbol she'd invented herself, an imperfect star inside a circle. Again, she murmured. She did not mean it as a complaint. Only as an acknowledgement. For 3 nights, a faint deviation had threaded through her readings. Not large enough for the Collegium to send a delegation. Not obvious enough to make the temple bells ring. But it was there, a fractional drift in the star lattice, the kind of whisper that, if ignored, became a scream. She leaned into the eyepiece. The world narrowed to a circle of black and burning points. She adjusted the focus until the stars sharpened, each one a precise pinprick. Her breath fogged faintly, then vanished. The star she tracked, one of the lesser ones, unnamed by common folk and dismissed as irrelevant by anyone who wanted stories instead of truth, held steady, then shimmered strangely, as if the light had hesitated. Serelis lifted her head, frowning, and looked up with her own eyes. At first, she saw only what she expected, the familiar scatter of the night. Then the sky shifted. It was not a cloud. It was not a trick of wind. The stars themselves seemed to tense, a subtle tightening across the vault, as if the firmament had become a skin and something beneath it had flexed. A streak of light appeared at the edge of her vision. Serelis froze. She had seen meteors, of course. Everyone had. Brief and bright, harmless as sparks, they flared and died, and people made wishes as if the sky were a generous thing. But this was not a meteor's casual burn. This was a blade, a bright, furious line cutting too low and too slow, holding its shape like a thrown spear. The air around her changed, as if the plateau drew in a breath. The streak widened. It began to shed fragments, small, glinting sparks that did not fade. They peeled away in a silent cascade and fell after it like a tail of broken jewels. A falling star, Serelis thought, and her mind supplied a dozen possible explanations, none of which belonged in the world she lived in. A miscalculated comet. A rupture in the upper atmosphere. An illusion caused by altitude. The light flared again, brighter, and the deck railing gleamed white. Instinct finally arrived, late but urgent. Serelis stepped back from the instruments, clutching her notebook, and turned toward the stairwell that led down into the observatory's stone belly. The wind struck her hard, sudden and hot, as if the air itself had been scorched. She stumbled. The falling star had shifted course. It was coming toward the plateau. A sound arrived, delayed by distance, an unearthly groan, like the sky's ribs breaking. The observatory lamps flickered. The brass-limbed instrument trembled on its mount. Serelis ran. Her boots scraped over frost-slick stone. Her breath tore. She reached the stairwell and grabbed the iron handle. The world brightened so violently it turned her shadow into a sharp black cutout on the wall. Heat slammed into her back. The railing behind her screamed as metal expanded. Something shattered, glass, maybe, or the thin lens of a smaller scope. She flinched, threw her forearm up over her eyes, and forced herself down the first steps. Stone underfoot. Darkness. The smell of old parchment and oil. The familiar. Then the stairwell shook. A jolt like a giant's fist hit the plateau. The air punched out of her lungs. Serelis fell forward, catching herself on the steps. Her notebook slipped from her hand and skidded, pages fluttering like startled birds. Dust sifted from the ceiling. Somewhere above, something crashed. Serelis coughed, tasting grit, and pushed herself upright. She reached for the notebook, her fingers barely brushed its edge, a second jolt hit, smaller but sharper, like an afterthought from a furious sky. The stairwell lights went out completely. For a heartbeat there was nothing but black and the distant roar of the impact outside, rolling away into the valley like thunder that could not decide where to settle. Serelis stood very still, listening to her own pulse. Then she heard something else. Not the groaning of beams. Not the hiss of extinguished lamps. Footsteps. They were above her, on the deck. Slow. Certain. Too measured to belong to Corith, her assistant, who would have been shouting her name by now if he had been awake. Too quiet to belong to the frightened Laboris in the lower rooms. The footsteps crossed the deck with an unhurried cadence, as if the person making them had all the time in the world and no reason to fear the sky. Serelis's throat tightened. She should call out. She should stay in the stairwell. She should run deeper into the observatory and bolt the door. Instead, she found herself climbing. It was foolish, she told herself as she climbed the steps in darkness, one hand braced against cold stone. It was reckless. But the falling star had been real, and her work had warned her something was wrong. If it had landed near the observatory, if it had broken the ridge, if it was leaking some kind of, her foot hit the top step. She hesitated, then pushed through the stairwell door. The deck was not dark anymore. Not truly. A pale glow spread across the stone as if moonlight had pooled there, though the moon itself hung behind thin cloud. The observatory lamps were still flickering, dim and panicked, but another light dominated, a steady radiance rising from beyond the railing on the far side, where the plateau sloped into broken rock. Serelis stepped out and the wind met her with an odd gentleness, as if it were holding its breath. She approached the railing. Beyond it, the ground had been torn open. A shallow crater smoked faintly, and at its center lay something that did not look like rock. It looked like a piece of sky that had forgotten it was supposed to be distant, dark at its core but edged with silver, pulsing as if it still remembered the rhythm of stars. Near the crater stood a man. Serelis's first thought was absurdly practical. How did he get there? The ridge path was narrow and half collapsed. No one could have climbed up in the minutes since the impact. Her second thought followed quickly. What is he doing near it? He was tall. Not broad in the way of Laboris, not lean in the way of scholars who forgot to eat. He had the stillness of something that had never needed to hurry. His hair was dark, the color of midnight ink. The wind moved it, but he did not seem to notice. His clothing was plain in cut but too fine in texture for the plateau, and it did not flutter as it should, it hung with a strange weight, as if stitched with something heavier than thread. He turned his head slightly, and Serelis realized he knew she was there. He looked up. Even from the distance, she felt the impact of his gaze like pressure on her skin. His eyes were not bright, not glowing. They were simply too clear, as if they had reflected starlight for a very long time. Serelis's fingers tightened on the railing. "Who are you?" she called, her voice roughened by dust and cold. The man did not answer immediately. He took one step away from the crater, as if to place himself between it and her. The movement was deliberate, protective in a way she could not explain. When he spoke, his voice carried across the wind with an unnerving calm. "You should not be on the deck." The words should have sounded like a command. They sounded like certainty. Serelis bristled anyway. "This is my observatory." His gaze did not flicker. "Then you have built too close to the boundary." Serelis felt her skin prickle. The boundary of what? The man's expression shifted by a hair's breadth. Not surprise, more like a flicker of something restrained. "Of the sky." That was nonsense. And yet the crater behind him pulsed again, sending a low shimmer across the stone. Her instruments, those that still stood, gave a faint metallic tremor, as if responding to a vibration too low to be heard. Serelis lifted her chin. "That thing fell. I saw it. If it's dangerous, I need to know. I need to record it." No, the word was quiet, but it landed with weight. Serelis stared. "You don't get to decide what I record." For the first time, he moved quickly. He crossed the rocky slope in a handful of strides that should have taken longer. His boots found purchase in places that did not look stable, and the wind seemed to slip around him rather than shove him. When he reached the base of the deck, he stopped and looked up at her, close enough now that she could see faint markings along his throat and collarbone, lines like pale scars, or the ghost of ink beneath skin. They were not decorative. They looked old and purposeful. "Your name," he said, and it was not a question. It was the kind of demand used by people who believed names mattered. Serelis's mouth went dry. A part of her, small, stubborn, refused on principle. Another part, older and more instinctive, whispered that refusal would be unwise. "Serelis Quen," she said. The air seemed to shift around the syllables, as if the night had leaned in to listen. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he had expected a different answer and was recalculating. Serelis, he repeated, tasting the sound. And you, she countered, forcing steadiness. Or do you only collect names? He held her gaze for a long moment, then answered. Aethyron Valecrest. The name did not feel like something a mother would give a child. It felt like a title wrapped in language. Serelis swallowed. Why are you here, Aethyron Valecrest? His eyes flicked past her to the damaged instruments, the shattered lens, the scorched railing. Because you were going to die. Serelis's breath caught. Excuse me? He looked back at her. The star did not fall by chance. Something in his tone made her spine go cold. Not fear of him, exactly. Fear of the idea that the universe could choose. Serelis forced herself to look past him, down at the crater. The strange object's pulsing had slowed, as if settling. Smoke curled from cracks in the stone around it, but the glow remained steady. If it didn't fall by chance, she said carefully, then why did it fall? Aethyron's jaw tightened, a subtle tension that suggested he was holding something back. Because the boundary weakened. Serelis's mind raced. Boundaries. Sky. Weakened. Her readings. The drift. The shimmer. You're speaking in riddles, she said, then stopped herself. He wasn't being poetic. He was being precise in a language she didn't have. Aethyron took a step to the side, angling so he could see both her and the crater. You should go inside. Wake the others. Do not approach the impact site. Serelis almost laughed, sharp and incredulous. You just told me I was going to die. Now you're giving me instructions like I'm a child. His eyes held hers. If you approach it, you will die. That was not the same claim as before. This one sounded like a rule. Serelis's hands tightened on the railing until the iron bit her palms. She wanted to push back, to demand proof, to insist that knowledge could not be hoarded by strangers with unnatural stillness and scar sigils. And yet, the object in the crater pulsed again, and for a moment Serelis felt something, an odd pressure behind her eyes, as if the stars overhead had turned their attention upon her. She blinked hard. The sensation faded, leaving only her own heartbeat. I can't just pretend it didn't happen, she said, quieter now. Aethyron's gaze softened by a fraction. It was the first hint she'd seen that he was capable of gentleness. You will not have to pretend, he said. But you must survive the night. Serelis opened her mouth to respond. The crater flared. It happened without warning. Light surged up like a breath released too fast. The air snapped with a sound like ice cracking. The wind changed direction abruptly, pulling toward the crater instead of pushing away. Serelis's body reacted before her mind did. She stepped back instinctively. The deck beneath her boots lurched. A shockwave rippled through the plateau. The railing she gripped bucked, and her hands slipped. The world tilted. For a weightless, awful moment, Serelis felt herself falling backward toward the stairwell opening, toward darkness and stone steps. Aethyron moved. He was not on the deck. He was below it. He should not have been able to reach her in time. Yet suddenly he was there, his hand closing around her wrist with a grip that was firm but not painful. Another hand braced her shoulder. His body anchored hers as the deck shuddered again. Serelis gasped, stumbling into him. The contact was brief. Necessary. Purely practical. And still, the instant his skin met hers, something tore open inside her awareness. Heat, not from the crater, but from within, flooded her chest. A sharp rush of emotion surged up, uninvited. Fear so bright it nearly became anger, relief so sudden it made her knees weak, wonder so deep it bordered on grief. For a heartbeat, it was too much. Tears sprang to her eyes without permission. Aethyron froze. Serelis felt it before she saw it, felt a strange echo, as if her own emotions had struck an unseen surface and bounced back. Not into her, but outward. Into him. His breath caught. His eyes widened by the smallest measure, and the faint markings on his throat flared with pale light, like constellations awakening under skin. Serelis stared, startled out of her panic. What? Aethyron released her as if burned. He stepped back, shoulders rigid, and his gaze snapped to his own hand as though he did not recognize it. Serelis's heart hammered. The deck steadied underfoot. The crater's flare subsided to its earlier glow, leaving only a faint crackle in the air. Aethyron's voice, when it came, was lower than before. Not angry. Not afraid. Strained. Do not touch me again. Serelis blinked, breathing hard. I didn't, you grabbed me. His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time the calm in his expression had fractured. Something raw moved behind it, unfamiliar even to him. That, he said, and the word sounded like an accusation against the universe, should not have happened. Serelis looked down at her own hand. Her wrist still tingled where his fingers had been. Not pain, something like an afterimage. Her thoughts scrambled for explanation. Static. Shock. Some kind of residual charge from the impact. But her emotions still churned in her chest, and beneath them was something else now, a strange sense of connection, as if a thread had been tied between her ribs and the space behind his eyes. Aethyron drew in a slow breath, visibly mastering himself. The light beneath his skin dimmed, retreating until his markings were barely visible again. He spoke with clipped precision, as if naming facts could make them manageable. A resonance bond. Serelis's brow furrowed. A what? A link formed by celestial contact. His gaze flicked to the crater. It is rare. It is forbidden. Forbidden was a word Serelis understood all too well. In the Collegium, forbidden simply meant inconvenient to someone in power. She stepped back from the stairwell opening, keeping her voice steady. You're telling me that star did something to me? Aethyron's eyes stayed on hers. It did something to both of us. Serelis's mouth went dry again, and she hated herself for it. How? He did not answer at once. His attention shifted briefly, as if listening to something beyond hearing, perhaps the sky itself. When he finally spoke, his voice had regained some of its earlier control, but it was laced with something new, thin as starlight and sharp as the edge of fear. Because I broke my vow to save you. Serelis stared. Your vow? Aethyron's gaze did not waver. To remain detached. To never bind myself to mortal consequence. Serelis's pulse pounded in her ears. You're not making any sense. Aethyron's expression tightened. You saw what fell. You felt what happened when I touched you. Sense will come later. For now, you must do as I say. Serelis wanted to argue. She wanted to demand his authority, his proof, his credentials, as if the universe cared for paperwork. But her legs were still unsteady. The night air felt too charged. And beneath her confusion, there was the aftertaste of that moment, his sudden, sharp reaction, the flare of light under his skin, the echo that had leapt between them. She forced a breath into her lungs. If you're so concerned about rules, she said carefully, why are you standing here talking instead of fixing it? Aethyron's jaw flexed. Because I cannot fix it while you are near the impact. Serelis followed his gaze to the crater. The fallen object pulsed again, slower now, like a heartbeat settling. You want me inside, she said. Yes. And if I refuse? The question left her mouth before she could stop it. Aethyron held her gaze for a long moment. There was no threat in his eyes. No cruelty. Only an unwavering sense of consequence. If you refuse, he said softly, the bond will strengthen in the wrong direction. Serelis's stomach tightened. What does that mean? Aethyron's voice was almost reluctant. It means what you feel will not stay only yours. Serelis's breath caught. The words landed with a strange weight, as if they were already true. She looked at him, at his rigid posture, the careful way he held himself as though his own body were a boundary he feared to cross. At the faint marks under his skin that had flared when she nearly fell. At the calm that now looked less like coldness and more like a discipline he'd had to learn the hard way. Serelis swallowed. I don't understand you, she said quietly. Aethyron's gaze softened again, almost imperceptibly. That is safer. Serelis felt an unexpected sting at that, as if the words were meant to protect her and yet also to keep her out. Behind her, from deeper in the observatory, a distant voice called her name, Corith, hoarse with sleep and alarm. A door banged. Footsteps rushed. Serelis glanced back toward the stairwell, then forward again. Aethyron had already turned slightly toward the crater, as if preparing himself to face it alone. The wind tugged at his coat, but he stood unmoved, a human-shaped certainty against the strange light. Serelis lifted her chin. I'm not leaving this unanswered, she said, not as a threat, but as a promise. Aethyron did not look back at her, but his voice reached her anyway, quiet and edged with something like resignation. I know. Serelis's throat tightened. She turned and hurried down the stairs into the observatory's dim interior as Corith's footsteps met hers in the hall. Lantern light bobbed, casting frantic shadows. Serelis. Corith grabbed her elbow, eyes wide. I thought the roof came in. Are you hurt? What was that? The whole mountain. I'm fine, she said quickly, though her wrist still tingled. Get the others awake. Secure the records room. And lock the lower storage doors. Corith stared at her, bewildered. Why? What? Just do it. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. She forced it softer. Please. Corith hesitated, then nodded and bolted down the corridor. Serelis stood alone for a moment in the lantern-lit hall, The stone walls close around her, the air still faintly charged. The observatory creaked as it settled, dust drifting in lazy spirals. Her emotions were still too high, too bright. Relief, fear, wonder, a strange, piercing awareness of being seen by something vast. And beneath it all, a new sensation she could not name, the faintest pull, as if a thread ran from her chest up through the ceiling, out into the night where Aethyron stood guard beside the fallen star. Serelis pressed her hand to her sternum, as if she could still that invisible tug. For an instant, only an instant, she sensed something that was not hers, a cold, startled emptiness, and behind it a flicker of yearning so ancient it felt like a wound. Serelis's breath caught. Then the sensation vanished, leaving her alone with the echo of it and the certainty that the night on Calbrith Plateau had changed the shape of her life. Above, the sky held its breath. And somewhere beyond the stone, a guardian who had sworn to feel nothing stood beside a fallen star, braced against the impossible, against emotion returning like starlight, and the mortal woman whose feelings had begun to echo inside him. Morning came reluctantly to Calbrith Plateau, filtered through thin cloud and a sky that looked as though it had not quite finished deciding what it wanted to be. Pale light crept over the stone and revealed the damage left by the night, scorched patches on the deck, a warped railing, shattered glass scattered like frost across the floor. The crater beyond the observatory still smoked faintly, its strange occupant hidden now beneath a hastily erected canopy of canvas and warded lattice that no one on the plateau could have built. Serelis had not slept. She sat at the long table in the records room, her notebook open before her, lantern burning low at her elbow. Ink dried in uneven patches on the page where she had written and rewritten the same observations, trying to find language precise enough to hold what she had felt. Each time she thought she had captured it, the words slipped, inadequate. The bond, Aethyron had called it. A resonance. She pressed the nib to the paper and forced herself to focus on what she could measure. Time of impact. Duration of flare. Temperature changes in the air. Structural stress on the observatory walls. Facts steadied her, as they always had. Facts did not care that her chest still felt too full, or that she kept thinking of the way Aethyron had recoiled when he touched her, as if she were something dangerous and precious all at once. A murmur of voices drifted in from the hall, Corith and two of the night workers, arguing in low tones. They had obeyed her instructions without understanding them, and now understanding was beginning to press in. Serelis closed the notebook. She needed air. She stepped out onto the deck and was met by a sky that looked almost ordinary. Almost. The stars were fading with the dawn, but she could still sense them, a strange awareness that prickled at the back of her mind. It was as if she had learned a new language overnight and could not stop translating. Aethyron stood at the edge of the deck, facing the horizon. He had not left. That realization sent an unexpected wash of relief through her, followed immediately by a sharper sensation like a tightening thread. Aethyron straightened slightly, as though he had felt it too. Serelis stopped a few paces behind him. She did not touch him. She remembered his warning too well. "You're still here," she said. "I cannot go far," he replied, without turning. "Not now." The words were neutral, but something beneath them vibrated, faint and strained. Serelis felt it in her chest, an echo of restraint pulled too tight. She folded her arms, more to give herself something to do than for warmth. "You built that," she said, nodding toward the warded structure around the crater. "The lattice. I've never seen its like." "It will hold for a time," Aethyron said. "Long enough to decide what must be done." "And what must be done?" Serelis asked. He turned then, slowly, as if movement itself required care. In the daylight, his features were more human than they had been under the stars, but the sense of otherness remained. The faint markings at his throat were subdued now, barely visible. "That depends," he said, "on how quickly the bond stabilizes." Serelis's pulse quickened. She hated how readily her body responded to his words, as if they were tied to something deeper than reason. "You said my feelings wouldn't stay mine," she said. "I felt something last night. Something that wasn't me." Aethyron's gaze sharpened, not in anger but in focus. "What did you feel?" She hesitated. Naming it felt like a violation, though she couldn't say of whom. "Loneliness," she said finally. "Not the kind that comes from being alone. The kind that comes from having watched everything pass you by." Aethyron's jaw tightened. He looked away toward the sky. "Then the bond is already active." Serelis swallowed. "And what do you feel?" He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "Confusion." The word startled her. She had expected something grander. "Fear. Pain. Fury. Because of me?" she asked, and hated how vulnerable it sounded. Aethyron met her eyes again. "Because of emotion." Serelis frowned. Those aren't the same thing. His expression stilled, as if she had struck something true without intending to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind slid between them, tugging at Serelis's cloak. Corith appeared at the stairwell, clearing his throat loudly. Serelis, he said, glancing at Aethyron with poorly concealed suspicion. We've got trouble. She turned. What kind? The Collegium sent a messenger at dawn. 2, actually. And a priest from the Starward Temple showed up not 10 minutes later. He lowered his voice. They both want to see the impact site. Serelis closed her eyes briefly. Of course they did. She opened them to find Aethyron watching her closely. You did not tell them everything, he said. It was not a question. I told them there was a structural incident and an unknown celestial phenomenon, she replied. That's not everything. His gaze lingered on her face, as if searching for something beyond the words. She felt again that odd pressure behind her eyes, as if he were not merely looking but listening. Good, he said at last. Serelis bristled. You don't get to approve my choices. No, Aethyron agreed. But your choices affect us both now. The word us settled between them, heavy and unsettling. Corith shifted uncomfortably. Serelis, he said, do you know who this man is? Serelis hesitated. She did not know what Aethyron was to the world beyond last night's impossible events. Guardian. Immortal. Boundary Keeper. None of those would make sense to Corith. They barely made sense to her. Involved, she said finally. In ways I'm still trying to understand. Corith looked unconvinced but nodded. Well, the Collegium won't wait long. Elevane Rusk herself sent the message. That sent a fresh wave of tension through Serelis. Elevane did not travel lightly, nor did she involve herself personally unless she smelled something worth controlling. I'll speak to them, Serelis said. Give me a moment. Corith hesitated, glanced again at Aethyron, then retreated down the stairs. Silence returned, taut and watchful. You will lie for me, Aethyron said quietly. Serelis stiffened. I will protect my work. His gaze softened by a fraction. And yourself. She exhaled slowly. You're asking me to trust you. I am asking you to survive, he replied. Trust may follow. Or it may not. Serelis studied him. In the clear light of morning, he did not look like a villain or a savior. He looked like a man bearing a weight no one else could see. Last night, she said carefully, when you touched me, I felt more than fear. I felt relief. Gratitude. Wonder. She paused. Did you feel that too? Aethyron's shoulders drew back, as if bracing against a blow. Yes. The single word landed harder than any speech could have. And that, he added, is the danger. Serelis's heart beat faster, but not with panic. With something else, something that made her want to step closer even as she forced herself to stay still. Explain, she said. The bond does not discriminate, Aethyron said. Strong emotion resonates. It seeks symmetry. What you feel, I will feel. What I feel, he trailed off. Serelis finished the thought quietly. I might feel too. He looked at her sharply. That must not happen. Serelis tilted her head. You don't trust yourself. Aethyron's expression went still. I trust myself too much. She did not know what to say to that. The wind rose slightly, carrying the scent of stone and distant pine. From below came the sound of boots on stone, more purposeful now. Voices. Authority. Serelis straightened. They're coming. Aethyron nodded once. Then listen to me. Do not allow them near the star. Do not speak of the bond. And if they press you. I know how to deflect scholars and priests, Serelis said. I've been doing it my whole career. His gaze held hers, searching. And if they threaten you? Her mouth curved in a wry smile. Then I'll know I was right to worry. Aethyron did not smile back, but something in his eyes eased, just a little. I will remain nearby, he said. Out of sight. Serelis hesitated. You said the bond strengthens if I'm near the impact. Yes. And if you're near me? His expression shifted, caught between caution and something else she could not name. That is, different. She felt that tightening thread again, faint but unmistakable. Different how? Aethyron looked away. Less predictable. Before she could press him further, footsteps sounded on the deck. Elevane Rusk emerged from the stairwell, flanked by 2 Collegium aides and a priest in dark blue robes stitched with silver stars. Serelis turned to greet them, her spine straight, her expression composed. Behind her, the air stirred. When she glanced back, Aethyron was gone. The meeting unfolded like a familiar dance. Elevane's gaze missed nothing, the damaged railing, the lingering scorch marks, the distant warded structure. Her questions were precise, her concern carefully calibrated. Serelis answered with equal precision. She spoke of anomalous readings, of structural damage, of the need for controlled study before exposure. She cited safety protocols and invoked collegium bylaws until the priest frowned and Elevain's lips thinned. Throughout it all, Serelis felt watched not by the delegation, but by something quieter, steadier. She sensed Aethyron's attention like a low hum beneath her thoughts. When Elevain finally insisted on approaching the crater, Serelis felt a sudden flare of anxiety, sharp and hot. And just as suddenly, it was not hers alone. A cold pressure pressed back against it, firm and restraining, like a hand braced against her racing pulse. The anxiety dulled, steadied. Serelis inhaled sharply. Aethyron. She forced her expression to remain calm and stepped forward. Director Rusk, she said, her voice steady, with respect, the lattice is unstable. If it fails with you near it, the Collegium will lose more than data. Elevain studied her, eyes narrowing. You're unusually protective of this site. Serelis met her gaze. Because it's unlike anything we've recorded. Rushing it would be irresponsible. The priest murmured something about omens. Elevain hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. Very well. Temporary quarantine. But this will not remain solely under your purview. Serelis inclined her head. I would expect nothing less. The delegation departed with visible reluctance. As their footsteps faded, the pressure in Serelis's chest eased. She exhaled and leaned against the railing, suddenly tired. You felt that, Aethyron's voice murmured behind her. She turned. He stood a few paces away, half in shadow, as if the light itself had chosen not to touch him fully. Yes, she said quietly. You steadied me. His expression was troubled. I should not have been able to. Serelis studied him, really studied him, and saw the strain beneath his composure. You said emotion weakens your control, she said. But that didn't feel like weakness. Aethyron's gaze searched hers, and for a moment she felt that echo again, his uncertainty brushing against her own thoughts. Or, she continued softly, maybe it's just a different kind of strength. The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Aethyron looked away first. This will worsen, he said. The more we remain close. The more we share space, thought, sensation. Serelis nodded slowly. Then we need to understand it. His eyes snapped back to hers. Understanding is not always salvation. No, she agreed. But ignorance has never saved me yet. Aethyron studied her for a long moment, and in that silence something shifted, not dramatically, not cleanly, but enough to be felt. Very well, he said at last. We will observe. The word we sent a quiet warmth through Serelis's chest, unwelcome and undeniable. She nodded. Carefully. Carefully, he echoed. Above them, the morning sky brightened, but the stars did not feel distant anymore. They felt attentive. And between a guardian sworn to detachment and a mortal who refused to look away, a bond settled into place, tenuous, dangerous, and alive. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm, as if the plateau itself were testing the limits of what it could hold. Serelis catalogued what she could, working with a care that bordered on reverence. She avoided the crater, respected the lattice Aethyron had raised, and focused instead on the sky. Yet the sky refused to remain a distant subject. Her awareness of it had sharpened, becoming something more intimate than sight alone. She felt the stars now, not their light, but their presence, a quiet pressure that ebbed and swelled like breath. And beneath that, always, was Aethyron. He did not stay visible for long stretches. He appeared at the edges of her days, at dawn, standing motionless beyond the deck as the sky brightened, at dusk, when the stars first pierced the fading light, sometimes in the middle of the night, when Serelis woke with the sense of being watched and found him there, not looking at her, but at the sky above her roof. They spoke little at first. Words felt too blunt for something so new and volatile. Instead, they shared proximity, carefully measured, always with an awareness of distance. Yet even that proved difficult. Serelis discovered the truth of the bond one afternoon as she worked alone in the upper chamber, charting the star lattice by hand. Her concentration fractured without warning, pierced by a sudden, sharp tension that did not originate in her own thoughts. She gasped and pressed a hand to the table. It was restraint. Not her own, she was not restraining anything, but something clenched tight, coiled and aching. It carried with it a flicker of memory that was not hers, endless nights standing watch, the repetition of centuries measured by falling light and silence. Aethyron. She stood abruptly and nearly knocked over her chair. The sensation faded as quickly as it had come, leaving her breathless and shaken. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with a strange clarity. She had not imagined it. The bond did not require touch. It did not even require intention. It required closeness. Serelis pushed back from the table and went to the deck. Aethyron stood at the far railing, his back to her, one hand braced against the stone. The sky above him shimmered faintly, as though reacting to an unseen pressure. "You're hurting," she said. He stiffened, then turned slowly. "You felt that?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "Then the bond is deepening." Serelis stepped closer before she could stop herself. The pull between them strengthened immediately, not painful but insistent, like a tide finding its level. "Why didn't you tell me it would do this?" she demanded, though her voice lacked heat. Aethyron met her gaze. "Because I did not know." That answer, simple and honest, disarmed her. She drew a steadying breath. "What were you feeling?" "Temptation," he said, and did not look away. "To intervene." "In what?" she asked. "In everything," he replied. "In your work. In the world. In your safety." Serelis's pulse quickened. "You already intervened. You saved my life." "That was an aberration," he said tightly. "This is a pattern." She frowned. "You make it sound like caring is a crime." "For me," Aethyron said quietly, "it is." The words carried weight, not melodrama. "Law." Serelis studied him, taking in the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his hands curled slightly as if resisting motion. "Who enforces this law?" she asked. "The Covenant," he replied. "And those bound to it." As if summoned by the word, the air shifted. Serelis felt it before she saw it, a sudden heaviness, a pressure like the sky lowering. The stars overhead dimmed, not in brightness but in presence, as if withdrawing. Aethyron's posture snapped taut. "They are coming." Serelis's heart stuttered. "Who?" "Other guardians." The wind stilled. Light bent strangely along the horizon, as though the air itself were being folded. Then figures emerged from nothing, not stepping into view so much as resolving into it, like shapes completing themselves. 3 of them appeared on the far edge of the plateau. They were not identical, but they shared a quality that marked them as something other than human. Their movements were precise, economical. Their eyes reflected the sky with unsettling clarity. At their center stood Maeloryn Thricebound. He was taller than Aethyron by a narrow margin, his presence heavy with authority. His skin bore visible scars that caught the light like crystal fractures, branching along his arms and throat. Serelis swallowed. She did not need Aethyron to tell her who he was. Maeloryn's gaze swept the plateau, then settled on Serelis with an intensity that made her feel pinned in place. "You," he said. His voice carried the sound of stone grinding slowly. "You are the anomaly." Serelis lifted her chin. "I have a name." "I know," Maeloryn replied. "And it is irrelevant." Aethyron stepped forward, placing himself subtly between them. "She is under my protection." Maeloryn's expression hardened. "You forfeit that claim by breaking covenant." Serelis's breath caught. She felt a surge of anger, not entirely her own, but it rose through her chest with startling force. Aethyron's hand twitched at his side. "I saved a life." "You endangered all others," Maeloryn said. "Emotion has already begun to bleed into you." Serelis felt it then, unmistakably, Aethyron's anger, sharp and controlled, pressing against her awareness. It startled her with its intensity. "You feel it, don't you?" Maeloryn said, his gaze flicking to her. "The echo." Serelis hesitated, then answered truthfully. "Yes." A ripple passed through the other guardians, a subtle disturbance. Maeloryn's eyes narrowed. "Then it is worse than I feared." Aethyron turned to Serelis, his voice low. "Do not react. Whatever you feel, hold it." Serelis clenched her hands, fighting the surge of emotions that threatened to spill. Fear. Anger. A sudden, aching protectiveness she did not want to examine too closely. Maeloryn took a step forward. The air thickened around him. The bond must be severed. Serelis's breath left her in a rush. "You can't." Maeloryn's gaze snapped back to her. "You are mortal. You are replaceable." The word replaceable struck like a blow, and the pain that followed was not hers alone. It tore through the bond, raw and immediate. Aethyron flinched. "No," he said, and the single syllable rang with power. The faint markings beneath his skin flared, bright as starlight. The plateau trembled. Serelis gasped as a wave of sensation washed through her. Aethyron's fury, restrained to a razor's edge. It burned, not wild but focused, terrifying in its control. Maeloryn's expression shifted, not to fear, but to grim recognition. "You are already compromised." Aethyron's voice shook, just barely. "The bond cannot be severed without killing her." Silence fell. Serelis's heart hammered. What? Maylorin regarded Aethyron coldly. Then you have doomed her by your weakness. Serelis stared at Aethyron, her mind reeling. Is that true? Aethyron did not look away. Yes. The word lodged in her chest, heavy and final. She took an unsteady breath. So what happens now? Maylorin answered before Aethyron could. Now, the bond will be contained. You will be isolated. Studied, if necessary. And if the resonance grows unstable. Aethyron moved. He stepped fully between Serelis and the Guardians, his stance unmistakably protective. You will not take her. Maylorin's gaze was unyielding. You will stand down. Serelis felt the tension spike, not just between them but within herself. Fear coiled tight, feeding the bond, amplifying everything. She forced herself to breathe, to think. If I am the problem, she said, her voice shaking but firm, then I should be part of the decision. Maylorin turned his attention back to her, measuring. You lack the perspective to decide. Then explain it to me, Serelis said. All of it. Aethyron looked at her sharply, but she met his gaze and did not look away. The pull between them steadied, as if responding to her resolve. Maylorin studied them both, then inclined his head a fraction. Very well. You are linked by celestial resonance. Her emotions now flow into you, Aethyron. Yours may soon flow into her. That exchange destabilizes the boundary. Serelis swallowed. And if the boundary fails? Starfall, Maylorin said. Uncontrolled. Repeated. The world will burn. The words were spoken without drama, which made them all the more terrible. Serelis's stomach twisted. Then let me leave the plateau. Aethyron's head snapped toward her. No. Maylorin regarded her with interest. Distance may slow the resonance. Then do it, Serelis said. Send me away. The thought of leaving hit her harder than she expected. A sharp ache bloomed in her chest, mirrored instantly by something cold and desperate through the bond. Aethyron's breath hitched. That pain. I know, Serelis said softly. But if staying risks everything. Maylorin nodded once. A temporary separation may buy time. Aethyron's hands curled into fists. The markings beneath his skin pulsed erratically. Time for what? Serelis asked. Maylorin's gaze did not soften. To determine whether Aethyron can relinquish what he has regained. Serelis frowned. What does that mean? It means, Aethyron said hoarsely, forgetting you. The words cut deeper than Serelis had expected. She felt the bond shudder, strain. No, she said, before she could think better of it. There has to be another way. Maylorin's eyes flicked between them. If there is, it has not yet been discovered. Serelis looked at Aethyron, really looked at him. At the tension he held like armor. At the way his gaze clung to her now, no longer distant, no longer detached. You saved me, she said quietly. I won't let that be the thing that destroys you. Aethyron's expression broke, just slightly. And I will not let you be the cost of my failure. The air hummed between them, thick with unspoken things. Maylorin took a step back. You have one cycle of the moon, he said. One. Prove stability, or we will intervene. The other guardians shifted, already preparing to depart. As they faded from the plateau, the pressure lifted, leaving Serelis lightheaded and shaking. She exhaled, suddenly exhausted. That went poorly. Aethyron's gaze remained fixed on the place where Maylorin had stood. It went as expected. Serelis hugged herself, the cold biting deeper now that the tension had passed. You were going to let them take me. No, Aethyron said immediately. I was going to let them kill me. She stared at him. That's not better. Aethyron finally looked at her, and in his eyes was something she had not seen before, fear, naked and unguarded. For me, he said quietly, it would have been simpler. The admission lodged in Serelis's chest, heavy and aching. She stepped closer, stopping just short of touching him. The pull between them tightened, steadied. Then we don't do what's simple, she said. We do what's right. Aethyron studied her, and for a moment the centuries seemed to fall away, leaving only a man faced with an impossible choice. Slowly, he nodded. Then we must understand the bond, he said. Fully. Quickly. Serelis nodded back. Together. The word rang between them like a vow neither of them was ready to name. Above them, the stars began to emerge again, faint and watchful, as if waiting to see which way the balance would tip. The separation began before either of them was ready to name it. Serelis left Calbrith Plateau at dawn 3 days later, riding down the narrow switchback path with Corith at her side and a small escort of Collegium guards riding well behind them. Officially, she was being sent to present preliminary findings to a southern observatory. Unofficially, she was being removed from the source of celestial instability. Aethyron did not accompany her. He stood at the edge of the plateau as she departed, a solitary figure against the pale sky, his presence held rigid by will alone. Serelis did not look back until the path curved and the observatory vanished behind stone and distance. When she did, he was still there. The ache that followed was immediate and startling. Serelis gasped, her hand flying to her chest. It was not pain exactly, more like a sudden hollowing, as if something essential had been pulled away. Beneath it throbbed a second sensation, colder and sharper, bleeding through the bond. Aethyron. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to keep riding. If distance was the answer, she would endure it. But the bond did not loosen as they traveled. It stretched. Each mile pulled it thinner, tauter, until Serelis could feel it humming inside her, a fine wire strung too tight. Emotions came in distorted fragments, now Aethyron's restraint twisting into something brittle, his loneliness sharpening into a cold, aching silence that seeped into her thoughts like frost. By the time they reached the lowlands, Serelis was pale and shaking. She insisted she was well. She lied convincingly. She had always been good at that. At night, in unfamiliar rooms beneath unfamiliar skies, she dreamed of falling stars that never reached the ground, arrested midair by hands she could not see. She woke with her heart racing, the echo of Aethyron's vigilance coiled around her like a borrowed instinct. Aethyron fared no better. Without Serelis's physical presence to anchor the bond, his control frayed. The celestial boundary responded unpredictably, starlight flickering along the horizon in places it should not. He spent his days reinforcing wards that had not required attention in centuries, his nights standing watch with a vigilance edged by fear. Emotion bled through the cracks. It came unbidden, Serelis's exhaustion, her frustration, her stubborn resolve. But beneath it all pulsed something deeper, steadier, her concern for him. It threaded through him like warmth he could not extinguish. It weakened him. Malorin returned on the 7th night. He arrived alone this time, his presence heavy with judgment. The boundary destabilizes, he said without preamble. Your separation has not resolved the resonance. Aethyron did not turn from the sky. It has slowed it. Barely, Malorin replied. And the cost is rising. Aethyron's jaw tightened. You warned me of this. You warned yourself, Malorin said. We simply recorded the consequences. Aethyron's hands curled. Then say it. Malorin's gaze hardened. You must relinquish what you have regained. Fully. Permanently. Aethyron closed his eyes. He had known this was coming. The covenant had always been clear. Immortality demanded emptiness. Detachment was not a virtue, it was a requirement. What does relinquish mean? Aethyron asked quietly. Malorin's voice did not soften. The bond will be severed from your side. Your capacity to receive mortal emotion will be burned away. You will remember her existence, but not its weight. Aethyron inhaled slowly. And she will grieve, Malorin said. Then she will heal. Mortals always do. The words struck with cruel efficiency. Aethyron opened his eyes and looked at Malorin fully. You never healed. Malorin's expression flickered, just barely. That is irrelevant. No, Aethyron said. It is instructive. Malorin stiffened. This is not about you. Aethyron laughed once, short and humorless. It is always about us. About what we choose to protect. Malorin studied him for a long moment. You have until the next starrise, he said. Decide. When he vanished, the silence he left behind was unbearable. Aethyron remained where he was long after, staring at the sky as if it might offer an answer. Instead, it reflected his turmoil back at him, every star a reminder of the countless nights he had stood watch, untouched, unchanged. For the first time in centuries, he envied mortals their pain. Serelis felt the shift the moment Malorin left. She was seated at a narrow desk in the southern observatory, surrounded by unfamiliar instruments, when a cold weight slammed into her chest. She doubled over, gasping, her vision blurring. Corith rushed to her side. Serelis, what is it? She shook her head, unable to speak. The bond screamed, no longer stretched but compressed, as if something were trying to crush it from the inside. Fear, not hers, flooded her awareness. Aethyron's fear, stark and raw. She grabbed the edge of the desk and forced herself upright. I need a horse. Corith stared. What? I need to return to Calbrith. Now. They won't allow it, Corith said, alarmed. Elevane was very clear. Then they can try to stop me, Serelis snapped. She steadied herself, breathing through the pain. If I don't go back, He will destroy himself. Korith hesitated only a moment before nodding. I'll saddle one. They left before dawn, slipping past half-asleep guards and riding hard through the thinning night. With every mile closer to the plateau, the pressure in Serelis's chest eased, not vanished, but eased enough for her to breathe. Aethyron felt her approach like a spark in the dark. The boundary steadied almost immediately, the wards settling as if relieved. He turned sharply toward the southern horizon, his heart, long silent, hammering with impossible force. She was coming back. Relief surged through him, followed by panic. He had not yet decided. If she returned before he relinquished the bond, the consequences. He did not finish the thought. Serelis reached the plateau at dusk, dust-streaked and breathless. She dismounted before the observatory gates and looked up. Aethyron stood there, waiting. The moment their gazes met, the bond surged, no longer strained but vibrant, alive with shared sensation. Serelis staggered, overwhelmed by the intensity of it. Aethyron crossed the distance in a heartbeat, catching her before she fell. This time, he did not pull away. The contact ignited everything. Emotion flooded him in a torrent, her fear, her determination, her anger at being excluded from her own fate. But beneath it all burned something bright and steady, trust. Serelis gripped his coat, steadying herself. They are going to make you forget me, she said, the words tumbling out. I felt it. Aethyron closed his eyes, his forehead resting briefly against hers. The stars above them flared in response. Yes, he said. At Star Eyes. Serelis's throat tightened. Then we do not let them. He opened his eyes, meeting hers. Defying the Covenant risks collapse. Or transformation, Serelis said. You told me the rules were incomplete. That they never accounted for emotion. What if that is because emotion is not a flaw? Aethyron searched her face, the bond amplifying every nuance. Hope stirred, dangerous and intoxicating. You would anchor the boundary with what you feel, he asked softly. With what we choose, Serelis corrected. Together. The idea was terrifying. Exhilarating. Footsteps sounded behind them. Maelorin emerged from the thinning air, flanked by two guardians. His gaze fixed on their joined hands. So, he said, you have chosen defiance. Aethyron straightened, placing himself at Serelis's side rather than in front of her. We have chosen balance. Maelorin's expression hardened. Emotion is not balance. It is volatility. Detachment is stagnation, Serelis said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. You preserve the sky by freezing it in place. Maelorin regarded her coolly. And you would burn it down. No, she said. I would let it move. The air vibrated, the stars overhead brightening in response to the rising tension. Maelorin raised a hand. This ends now. Aethyron felt the Covenant tighten around him, ancient power rising to enforce compliance. Pain lanced through him as the bond began to constrict, threatening to snap. Serelis cried out, clutching her chest. No. Aethyron roared. He reached inward not to suppress emotion, as he had been trained, but to embrace it. To accept the flood rather than dam it. The stars answered. Light poured through him, not searing but reshaping. He felt something give way, an old anchor tearing free, taking with it the endless numbness that had defined him. He staggered, breath tearing from his lungs. Serelis held him upright, her own strength bolstered by the bond. Maelorin recoiled, shock flashing across his stern features. You would relinquish immortality? Not all of it, Aethyron gasped. Only the part that required emptiness. The Covenant screamed as it rewrote itself, celestial energy spiraling around them. The boundary shuddered but did not break. Instead, it settled. The stars dimmed, then steadied, their light warmer, more alive. Silence fell, heavy and stunned. Aethyron straightened slowly, the pain ebbing. He felt changed. Not mortal. Not untouched. Something in between. Maelorin stared at him, disbelief etched into every line. You have undone us. Aethyron met his gaze, steady and unafraid. No. I have given us a future. Maelorin looked at Serelis then, truly seeing her for the first time not as an anomaly, but as a constant. You will regret this, he said. Perhaps, Serelis replied softly. But we'll regret it together. The guardians withdrew, their forms dissolving into starlight, leaving the plateau quiet beneath a sky that no longer felt rigid. Aethyron turned to Serelis, his expression awed and uncertain. The bond remains, he said. Changed, but present. Serelis smiled, exhausted and fierce. Good. Above them, the stars continued their slow, eternal motion, no longer held apart by fear, but guided by connection. And the night, for the first time in centuries, felt balanced. The first dawn after the Covenant changed arrived without thunder or proclamation. Light touched Calbrith Plateau gently, washing the stone in soft gold. The observatory stood as it always had, scarred, weathered, stubborn, but the air around it felt different. Lighter. As if the world had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Serelis woke to birdsong. It took her a moment to place the sound. Birds rarely nested this high, but there it was, clear, tentative notes threading through the morning air. She lay still, listening, her hand resting over her chest. The bond was there. Not loud. Not demanding. A quiet presence, steady and warm, like a star that did not need to burn fiercely to be seen. She sat up and found Aethyron standing near the open window, watching the horizon. He had not slept either, but the rigid stillness that had once defined him was gone. He stood with his weight unevenly distributed, one shoulder resting against the stone, as if he no longer feared leaning on the world. Serelis studied him without speaking. The markings beneath his skin were different now, fainter, softer, no longer etched like chains but flowing like lines drawn by hand. His eyes, when he turned to her, held the sky as they always had, but now there was something else there, unmistakable and human. "How do you feel?" she asked. Aethyron considered the question carefully. "Present," he said at last. "It is unsettling." She smiled faintly. "You'll adjust." "I am not certain I want to," he replied, and there was no fear in his voice. Only honesty. They stepped out onto the deck together. Below, the crater was gone. In its place lay a smooth basin of stone, glassed and harmless. The fallen star dissolved into nothing more than a faint shimmer that faded even as Serelis watched. "The boundary absorbed it," Aethyron said. "Rebalanced itself." Serelis nodded. "Through you." "Through us," he corrected gently. The word no longer frightened either of them. News arrived slowly, carried on cautious feet and quieter voices. Elevane Rusk returned 2 days later, this time alone. She walked the plateau with measured steps, her sharp gaze taking in the sky, the instruments, the absence of catastrophe. "The stars are stable," she said at last, displeasure and relief warring in her tone. "They are," Serelis agreed. Elevane studied her. "You have changed." "So has the sky," Serelis replied. Elevane's gaze flicked to Aethyron, lingering there with new awareness. "The Collegium will demand explanations." "They will receive them," Aethyron said calmly. "In time." "And your authority to offer them?" Elevane asked coolly. Aethyron met her gaze without flinching. "The boundary still stands." That, it seemed, was enough. The Guardians did not return. Serelis suspected Maylorin watched from afar, measuring outcomes he had never imagined. But no intervention came. The stars continued their ancient paths, now with subtle variations that made Serelis's hands itch for ink and paper. Her work resumed, not as before, but deeper. She no longer observed the heavens as a distant scholar alone. She listened. Patterns revealed themselves more readily now, not because the stars spoke, but because she had learned how to hear. Aethyron remained. He did not vanish into myth or retreat beyond the sky. He walked the plateau with her, learned the observatory's creaks and drafts, listened as she explained theories he had watched unfold over centuries without ever questioning. Some nights they stood side by side in silence, the bond between them humming softly, neither overwhelming nor absent. Sometimes, Serelis felt his calm steady her when her thoughts raced. Sometimes, he felt her quiet joy remind him why the sky was worth guarding. They did not rush what grew between them. Affection took root in small, deliberate ways, a shared glance when a calculation proved true, the ease with which they moved around one another, the unspoken certainty that neither stood alone anymore. One evening, as twilight bled into star eyes, Serelis closed her notebook and leaned against the railing. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Aethyron did not answer at once. He watched the first stars appear, their light gentle and alive. "No," he said. "For the first time, I understand what I was protecting." Serelis tilted her head. "And what is that?" He turned to her, his gaze warm and unguarded. "The possibility of connection." The bond pulsed faintly between them, not demanding, not consuming, simply present. Serelis reached out and took his hand. This time, there was no flare, no shock of pain or terror. Just warmth, shared and steady. Above them, the stars shone on, not distant, not indifferent, but balanced. And beneath their light, an immortal who had once envied the heavens stood with a mortal who had taught him how to feel again, bound not by fear or sacrifice, but by choice.